Hello everyone, I've got something a little bit different for you today. So this video is still a part of my The History of Magic the Gathering series, but it's a bit of an extra video, a bit of side content before we progress into the modern era. I've made this for two reasons. Number one, I wanted to talk a bit about the history of formats, which are different ways of playing the game.
And that's sort of hard to do using my talk about one card from each set methodology. And number two, I've had some comments that a timeline would be useful, so I figured I'd provide one. There's a link to my timeline in the description, and I'll be using it throughout the video. So, we've just finished talking about what I'm going to call the classical era of Magic the Gathering. That spans the 10 years of sets released from 1993 until 2003, from Alpha to Scourge. Cards from this classical era still have the classic card frame and look very different from cards in the present day. We're now moving into what I'm going to call the early modern era of the game. This contains every card from 8th edition, which was released in July 2003, until Magic 2013, which was released in 2012. Core sets from 2009 onwards are always named after the year following their release, partially to demonstrate they're still usable in Standard for another year, and partially just to be confusing. I'd like to draw special attention to 8th edition as, on top of being the first set in this early modern era, it was also the first set which I purchased cards from. I was just a young boy with a single-digit age when my grandfather bought me the 8th edition core game set, a starter product which came with two very simple starter decks, as well as a promotional foil Elvis Champion, a card that still sits proudly in my binder today. So I'm going to make Elvis Champion the unofficial card which represents 8th edition, because it was my first ever card from my first ever set. In any case, I'm getting sidetracked. Return to Ravnica was released in October 2012, marking the beginning of what I'll call the Pioneer era. Cards released from this point onwards are legal in the Pioneer format, a concept which I'll explain momentarily.
Part way into this period, with the release of Core Set 2015, in 2014 of course, the cardboard has changed yet again. These changes aren't quite as drastic as the changes between Scourge and 8th edition, but they're still noticeable. The information at the bottom of the cards was reformatted, and it's all written much more clearly now, and there's a little letter marking out each card's rarity.
Speaking of rarity, all rare and mythic rare cards got a little foil sticker. Finally, with the release of Dominaria in 2018, the frames of legendary cards were also altered, to make them seem jagged and unique. So I've separated the game into these three eras, now let's talk a bit about formats. What do I mean when I say formats? Well, to put it simply, formats are different methods of playing the game, in which different sets of cards are legal or illegal. Well, allowed and not allowed. Nobody's going to arrest you for attempting to play an Ancestral Recall in Standard. Initially, there were no formats. Any card was legal at any time. There weren't even any deck construction limitations, beyond the fact that your deck had to contain a minimum of 40 cards. Do you want to build a deck which has 20 copies of Mons Goblin Raiders and 20 Mountains? Go ahead, there's nothing stopping you. It's from this era that the Channel Fireball combo was born. Channel Fireball decks were early combo decks, which would contain nothing except Black Lotuses, Mountains, and the cards Channel and Fireball. On turn 1, you play a Mountain and crack a Black Lotus, generating 3 green mana. You use that green mana to cast the spell Channel, with 1 green to spare. Channel means that you can add any amount of colourless mana to your mana pool at the cost of 1 life per mana you generate. Then, you tap your Mountain to play Fireball. Fireball lets you turn X amount of mana into X amount of damage. As such, by paying 19 life and using that spare sliver of green mana for earlier, you're able to deal 20 damage to your opponent on turn 1, winning you the game. The fact that your deck contained these 4 cards in any number and any ratio ensured this combo could be pulled off relatively consistently, and Channel Fireball is probably the most famous combo in the history of the game. The card selling website and corresponding competitive team, Channel Fireball, draws its name from this early combo. Unfortunately, well, actually, probably fortunately, this craziness couldn't last. In winter 1994, it all changed. A group called the Duelists Convocation International was formed, although this organisation is now better known by the acronym DCI. The DCI established several ground rules which transform Magic the Gathering from an untamed Wild West to a regulated game which could be played competitively in a tournament environment. The minimum deck size was set to 60, and the now ubiquitous 4-card limit was introduced. The DCI also announced the game's very first restricted list, several powerful cards which players were limited to only a single copy of in their tournament decks, though notably, nothing was banned just yet.
In January 1995, Wizards of the Coast created the game's first official formats,
splitting the game's card pool in two. In the format Type 1, every card ever printed remained legal, whilst in Type 2, only cards released since April 1994 were legal. meaning only cards from Revised, which is a core set that was a curated version of Alpha without its more problematic and powerful cards, as well as the Dark and Fallen Empires could be used. It's hard to overstate how massively controversial this was. We Magic the Gathering players are rather infamous for saying that certain changes will kill the game. This was the first such moment in the game's history. Players were furious that their oldest and most valuable cards were no longer legal in all tournaments, and were even more incensed by the apparent intention that this process would continue, and that old cards would be sliced out of tournament usability as new sets came in. In July 1997, a third format was created to fill this void, known as Type 1.5. In Type 1.5, cards from a game's entire history would be legal, however any card which was restricted in Type 1 would be fully banned. These three formats have evolved over time, and are now known better by other names. Type 1 is better known as Vintage, the game's most powerful format, where players can use any card, albeit only a single copy of the game's most powerful cards, such as Black Lotus and Ancestral Recall. While I say you can use any card, there are a few exceptions. You can't use Chaos Orb or Falling Star, as they rely on manual dexterity, which puts handicapped players at a disadvantage. You can't use Shahrazad, because she massively extends the duration of games, and enables incredibly unfun tactics which rely on winning game 1 and then attempting to run out the clock. And you can't use Lurrus of the Dream Den, because that card's a hot mess. There are also a handful of cards from the game's early days which are banned, as they're deemed to be offensive. Finally, you also can't use Conspiracy cards, which only work in their unique draft format of the two Conspiracy sets, and you can't use Anti-cards, because they break gambling laws. So yeah, except for this very small collection of exceptions, you're allowed to use every Magic card which has ever been printed in Vintage. Type 1.5 is now known as Legacy. As I mentioned above, it's like Vintage, only the game's most powerful cards are banned, rather than merely restricted. Both of these formats are unfortunately very expensive to build decks for, and I do mean very expensive. A Legacy deck will cost you thousands. A single card for a Vintage deck will cost you tens of thousands. These formats are dominated by high power, low cost instants and sorceries, predominantly drawn from the game's early days before the game's power level had been properly worked out. Type 2 is now known as Standard, the game's most popular competitive format, which contains only cards from the past 2 years. Standard decks are, well, relatively cheap. A tournament viable Standard deck will usually have a price tag in the low hundreds, but they can be cheaper.
Aggro decks for Standard usually cost about £50 to £70, which is about $80 to $100 for you Americans.
Standard is the primary format which Magic the Gathering's online MTG Arena client is focused on. Every September, Standard rotates. This means old sets are removed so new sets can be added. This is about to happen this year with the release of the set Zendikar Rising, which will push the sets Guilds of Ravnica, Ravnica Allegiance, War of the Spark, and Core Set 2020 out of Standard. Next September, Throne of Eldraine, Pharos Beyond Death, Ikoria Lair of Behemoths, and Core Set 2021 will rotate, and then in 2022, Zendikar Rising will be gone, along with whatever sets are released from now until next August. Let's talk about some of the game's newer formats. As I've mentioned, the game's modern format contains every card from the release of 8th edition in 2003 onwards. Modern cards are marked out by being any card without classic borders. Well, apart from a handful of so-called time-shifted cards from a set Time Spiral, which still look like classic cards, but are actually modern legal. Modern decks have price tags in the medium to high hundreds, although most of this is contained in their mana base, in other words the lands which they contain. The best lands available in Modern are the so-called Fetchlands. These command huge price tags, and make up a big part of the cost for most modern decks. Wizards of the Coast don't like reprinting Fetchlands frequently. They claim this is because they slow the pace of the game down, as they make you search through and shuffle your deck. Then, there's Pioneer, a format introduced in October 2019, in which only cards from Return to Ravnica onwards are legal. Although the Fetchlands were reprinted in sets which are in Pioneer, they're banned from the format, which brings the cost of Pioneer decks down significantly compared to modern decks. Pioneer decks tend to cost a few hundred, a little bit more than a top-of-the-line Standard deck. As Pioneer is very new, its long-term viability is not yet known. It was dominated for a long time by combo decks, based on using the card Inverter of Truth to empty your deck, and then the card Thassa's Oracle to turn this into a win condition. This is broadly considered to have made the format incredibly dull, but the ban hammer came down, saving the format and bringing players back. Hopefully Pioneer has a long and prosperous future ahead of it. Next up is Historic. Historic is a bit of a weird format. Outside of Standard, it's the other format which is available to play in Arena. Historic contains every set which has been released in Standard since Arena came out, so back to Ixalan. But it also contains several cards chosen by Wizards of the Coast from older sets,
like Blood Artist and Goblin Chieftain.
Recently, most of the cards from Amonkhet block were also added to Historic, with the release of Amonkhet Remastered in August 2020. but Amonkhet Remastered cut some cards from Amonkhet and Hour of Devastation and added some other cards from the game's past. Like I've said, the cards which are included in Historic are slightly eclectic and random, but it's a pretty fun format which you can play on Arena. It has a larger online presence than a physical presence though, so you probably don't want to build a Historic deck in real life. Finally, there are a few other ways of playing the game, most notably Commander. Commander, originally known as Elder Dragon Highlander, or EDH, is a format which was started by fans. Fans continue to run the format's committee, which decides on things like bannings. Commander is now one of the most popular ways of playing the game, due to its social nature and multiplayer focus. In Commander, you build 99 card singleton decks, which contain only a single copy of each card you include, except for lands. You then pick a legendary creature to be your commander, who will lead your deck. Every card in your deck must contain one of the colours in your commander's colour identity. So for example, if you pick a commander who's mono black, like Obnixilis Unshackled, then all of the cards in your deck need to be mono black. If you pick a commander with a broader colour identity, like Adeliz the Cinderwind, then cards in your deck can be from either of the colours in her identity, so either red or red and blue. Your commander is set apart from your deck, and can be summoned into play from an area called the Command Zone, rather than from your hand. This enables you to build decks which are built to operate around the ability provided by a single creature. As well as Commander, there's also Kitchen Table Magic, a casual and unofficial format where you just grab a clump of cards and play against your mates. Wizards of the Coast claim this is by far the most popular way people interact with the game, and I think it's certainly how we all start out. One more quick format to mention is Pauper, a fun and very cheap format where your deck can only contain common cards. Other than locking out anything that's uncommon or rarer, Pauper does have a ban list, but otherwise any common card from the game's history is good to go. All of the formats we've discussed above are so-called constructed formats, where you design a deck beforehand and head into the game with your deck already prepared. The final three formats I'm going to discuss here are what are known as limited formats, where deck building is a part of the process of play.
Booster drafting is one of the most fun ways of playing the game. You sit down with between 4 and 9 friends, or enemies, who happen to also enjoy playing Magic, and each of you buys 3 packs. You remove the lands and tokens from your packs, and then you take a card and pass the pack along. You then take a card from the pack you've just been handed and pass it along again. You continue this until pack 1 is empty.
You move on to pack 2, and then pack 3. By the end, if you've done it right, you should have assembled a synergistic collection of cards ready to be forged into a deck. Mirage was the first set designed with a draft experience in mind, and all modern sets are designed with several possible archetypes to build around. Unfortunately, given the current state of the world, it can be quite hard to assemble enough people to begin a physical booster draft. But don't worry, you can also draft digitally on Magic the Gathering Arena. Then there's Sealed. Sealed is like a booster draft, except you buy 6 packs and you don't do any of that passing cards malarkey. You just open your 6 packs and then build a deck from what's inside them. If you've ever attended the pre-release for a new set, then you've played Sealed. Finally, there's Cube. I plan on making a video where I talk about cubing in the future, but essentially a cube is a curated collection of cards picked out by a player and designed to serve as its own limited environment. You can build a cube by gathering together a collection of cards from across the 5 colours. Small cubes usually contain 360 cards, medium cubes have 450 cards, and large cubes have 540 cards. Cubes are pretty great, given that you can design your own archetypes and bring together synergies which you personally enjoy building around. They can be quite expensive though, especially if you want to make a power cube with the game's best cards in. Alright, so there we have it. A broad timeline of the history of the game, and a history of the most popular currently played formats. I'll see you all in part 6 for the next official section of my history of Magic the Gathering. Goodbye!